Episode 13, Africa and the Slave Trade. Question 1. How might internal African political developments, either independent of or affected by Europeans, have contributed to the slave trade? Was this a greater factor than the European demand for slaves? A variety of political developments in Africa in the 14th and 15th centuries affected various parts of the sub-Saharan regions. In many places in Africa, as in Europe, independent states continued to form and expand, fueled by iron technology and improved farming. Scholars disagree on the extent to which these long-term developments were affected by Europeans and the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. Some argue that the growth of large kingdoms was the dominant theme of the period, and slavery was just a byproduct of that. Others disagree, arguing that European demand and also European products such as gunpowder weaponry were the major impulses in political expansion. Large African states' capacity for large-scale slavery predates the involvement of Europeans, but the scale of the Atlantic slave system would not have been so great were it not for European demand. The use of European guns accelerated the growth of the slave trade itself, but was not the cause of the genesis of these states. While the blame is not equally shared, African kingdoms did play a critical role in the growth of the Atlantic slave system. Question 2. What were the limitations of Portuguese slave raids? What role, then, would local authorities play in the slave trade? The efforts of Henry the Navigator and others to push south down the African coast ultimately bore fruit when they finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1487. Along the way, they established fortified positions for trade and resupply purposes. These were called factories, forts, and trading posts with resident merchants. These forts allowed the Portuguese to exercise significant local control with minimal personnel needed. Although earlier voyages carried out some slave raids, once the cannon range was exceeded, they simply lacked the manpower necessary to impose their will on the larger West African states. Therefore, most forts were established with the consent of local rulers, who benefited from access to European commodities, like gunpowder weapons, and sometimes direct European military assistance in local conflicts. With the Portuguese unable to extend their zone of control into the African interior, the slave trade would not have been anywhere near as extensive were it not for the participation of African slave states. Question 3. How would the Portuguese pattern of colonization differ from that of the Spanish in the New World? The societies encountered by the Spanish when they arrived in the New World, despite their sophistication, were no match for the advanced European technologies. This, paired with the rapid depopulation due to the introduction of European diseases, meant that the Spanish encountered very little resistance. The Spanish could therefore take control of vast territories in which they would establish settler colonies that saw waves of immigration from Spain. Portugal, on the other hand, enjoyed no such fortune. The societies they encountered, though technologically behind Europe, were nonetheless big enough and powerful enough to resist any Portuguese efforts to establish in Africa the same type of settler colonies the Spanish had established in the Americas. The sparsely populated areas in the African northwest and southwest that would become Portuguese colonies were resource poor and thus unsuitable for large-scale colonial settlements. The Portuguese would establish zones of control within which they could dominate, either through diplomacy or warfare, the local powers, but they could never weaken the powerful African states enough for a complete takeover. Question 4. Why was the United States able to leave the international slave trade earlier than in other parts of the Americas? The high mortality and low fertility of slaves in the Caribbean was the primary driver behind the massive volume of the transatlantic slave system. Most American regions that used slaves did not manage to maintain the population. The only way to stabilize or grow the number of slaves was to continuously replenish the population with newly imported captives. The exception to this pattern was the United States. Whereas the sugar monoculture and climate of the Caribbean resulted in deadly conditions, the more temperate climate and less arduous labor meant that the slave populations in the British colonies would eventually become self-sustaining. The United States would ban the importing of slaves, not out of morality, but because it had become unnecessary to them. Question 5. Some historians have argued that the profits from the slave trade provided capital without which the commercial and industrial revolutions would not have been possible. Why is this unlikely? Some historians argue that the profitability of the slave trade was so great and constant that it was a major element in the rise of commercial capitalism and, later, the origins of the Industrial Revolution. Without a doubt, many people profited from the trade of African slaves. Any given voyage could make a profit of 300%, and the peripheral industries related to the slave trade, shipbuilding, provisioning, etc., derived significant profits. But the slave trade involved substantial risks and costs, so that in the long run, profitability levels did not remain so high. In the late 18th century, profitability in the English slave trade would have been somewhere between 5 and 10%, less so in the French, Dutch, and Portuguese trades. The slave trade was minimally more profitable in the long run than most commerce and trade of the time, but at levels nowhere near high enough to have played an inordinate role in the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Question 6. Why was slavery integral to the commercial and industrial revolutions? Despite the aforementioned relative insignificance of the profits of the slave trade, the wealth generated from slave labor did contribute to the development of capitalist and pre-industrial revolution economies. The importance of slavery to the economies of Europe was directly tied to the plantation and mining economies of the Americas. During some periods, a quote-unquote triangular trade existed in which slaves were taken to the Americas. The products of this labor, sugar, tobacco, cotton, etc., were then carried to Europe, and European manufactured goods were sent to the coast of Africa to begin the cycle all over again. Though it is likely impossible to calculate the value of goods produced in Europe for exchange in the triangular trade, as well as the profits derived in the colonies from slave labor, the persistence of slavery indicates its viability. The raw materials produced with slave labor, most significantly cotton, would be used in industrial manufacturing and thus provided a key ingredient in the growth of the Industrial Revolution. Question 7. Compare and contrast classical feudal serfdom with chattel slavery. Both systems bound people to labor under the control of a dominant class, but the nature of that bondage was fundamentally different. In feudal serfdom, which characterized much of medieval Europe, peasants were legally tied to the land rather than owned outright by another person. A serf owed labor, rent, or a share of produce to a lord, ostensibly in exchange for protection and access to land to sustain a household. The serf was considered to be part of an estate's property in a legal sense, yet was still recognized as a human subject with certain customary rights. Those rights varied, but might include the ability to marry, maintain a family, inherit a holding, and appeal to manorial courts. Serfdom was oppressive and restrictive, but it was embedded in a reciprocal, if unequal, social order that presumed mutual obligations between lord and peasant. Chattel slavery, by contrast, was an institution that reduced humans to movable property, literally chattels, equivalent to livestock or tools in the eye of the law. Slaves had no recognized legal personhood and no inherent rights that masters were bound to respect. Ownership was absolute and transferable. Slaves could be bought, sold, punished, or killed with little or no legal consequence. In the Atlantic world, slavery was also hereditary and racialized. The condition of enslavement was passed from mother to child, and skin color and ancestry became the defining marker of social status. Unlike serfdom, which existed within a broader system of Christian social hierarchy, chattel slavery deliberately dehumanized its victims to justify their exploitation in plantation economies driven by global capitalism. There were also significant economic differences. Feudal serfdom was primarily a subsistence based agrarian system. The goal was to sustain local communities, and thus the labor obligations were heavy but seasonal, and serfs retained some control over their own production and time. Chattel slavery, especially in the Americas, operated within a market economy that sought to maximize profits through intensive, export oriented production of sugar, cotton, and tobacco. This required relentless labor, high mortality, and constant replenishment through the slave trade. Where feudal lords sought obedience and continuity, American slaveholders prioritized productivity and disposability. Socially and morally, the distinction could not be starker. Serfdom placed people in a rigid social hierarchy, but still acknowledged their membership in the community of Christendom. A serf had a soul and was thus eligible for salvation. Chattel slavery stripped away even that basic recognition of shared humanity. It was not simply a labor system, but a total institution of domination, an attempt to commodify human life itself. In summary, both feudal serfdom and chattel slavery exploited captive labor, but serfdom was a system of social subordination within a moral universe of mutual obligation, while chattel slavery was a system of total ownership that denied the slave legal, social, or spiritual personhood. Serfdom imprisoned labor. Slavery annihilated identity and humanity. Question 8. What is the importance of the pre-existing slave networks with regards to the Atlantic slave trade? The pre-existing slave networks within Africa played a crucial role in shaping and enabling the transatlantic slave trade. Long before Europeans arrived, many African societies engaged in various forms of servitude and slave trading that were integrated into local economies and political systems. These systems, however, differed significantly from the racialized chattel slavery that developed in the Americas. Enslavement in Africa was often the result of warfare, debt, or punishment, and enslaved individuals might be eventually absorbed into the families or armies of their captives rather than exploited for large-scale plantation labor. Nevertheless, the existence of these networks helped both the logistical foundation and the political framework later exploited by European traders. When European powers began seeking labor for their colonies in the Americas, they encountered African rulers and merchants who were already familiar with the trading of captives as commodities within their own regional markets. The coastal kingdoms and trading states of West and Central Africa were positioned to serve as intermediaries between inland suppliers and European buyers. This pre-existing infrastructure facilitated the rapid expansion of the Atlantic system. Routes, markets, and mechanisms of exchange already existed, and the arrival of European goods, especially firearms, textiles, and metalware, intensified the scale and violence of slave procurement. The demand for labor across the Atlantic transformed older systems of servitude into a vast export-oriented enterprise that engulfed much of sub-Saharan Africa in cycles of warfare, raiding, and depopulation. In essence, Europe did not introduce slavery to Africa, but did redirect and amplify established practices. The pre-existing trade networks made the transatlantic slave trade both feasible and profitable, allowing European traders to access captives without establishing inland control. Over time, the enormous external demand distorted African economies and politics, shifting power towards states and leaders who specialized in supplying human beings for export. Thus, the prior existence of internal and interregional slave trading did not cause the Atlantic slave trade. but provided the infrastructure, practices, and political relationships that enabled its explosive growth and catastrophic human consequences. Question 9. What was the gun and slave cycle? The gun and slave cycle was a destructive feedback loop that linked European demand for slave labor with African demand for European firearms during the height of the Atlantic slave trade. European traders brought guns, ammunition, and manufactured goods to coastal African states, exchanging them for captives who were then shipped across the Atlantic. The influx of firearms dramatically intensified warfare among African states and communities. States with better access to European guns gained military advantages over their rivals, allowing them to capture more people and trade them for still more weapons. This cycle created a self-perpetuating spiral of violence. The more guns a kingdom acquired, the more it needed continual warfare to obtain captives for trade and to maintain its regional dominance. Over time, societies that participated in the trade became increasingly dependent on European goods and destabilized by internal conflict. Populations declined, political systems eroded, and economies shifted away from more sustainable economic activities like agriculture and crafts towards the ultimately unsustainable slave trade. For Europeans, the system was extremely profitable. It ensured a steady supply of enslaved labor for the Americas, while simultaneously keeping African states divided and reliant on European traders. The gun-slave cycle thus represents one of the most devastating dynamics of the Atlantic world, a process that turned entire regions of West and Central Africa into areas of chronic warfare and demographic collapse, driven by the intersection of European mercantilism and African political competition. Question 10. Why would South Africa come to have the largest white population in Africa? How does this relate to patterns of colonization and the slave trade? South Africa came to have the largest white population in Africa because it offered a combination of geographic, climate, and economic conditions that made permanent European settlement not only possible, but desirable, a pattern distinct from most other parts of the continent. When the Dutch East India Company established a supply station at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652, the region's Mediterranean-like climate and fertile soil made it well suited for European-style agriculture. Over time, Dutch settlers, later known as Boers or Afrikaners, expanded inland, establishing family farms rather than merely extractive trading posts. This encouraged permanent colonization rather than the transient coastal presence typical elsewhere in Africa. The pattern continued under British rule in the 19th century, when new waves of settlers arrived seeking land, economic opportunity, or religious freedom. Unlike regions in West or Central Africa that were integrated into the Atlantic slave trade, South Africa lay outside the main trading routes. Its economy relied less on exporting enslaved Africans and more on imported slave labor from East Africa, Madagascar, and Asia, and later on local African labor systems tied to settler agriculture and, eventually, mining. Because the region was relatively sparsely populated, settlers could displace or dominate indigenous populations through frontier warfare and land appropriation. Essentially, South Africa's large white population reflects a settler colonial model rather than a mercantile or slave trade model. Europeans came not only to exploit but to inhabit the land permanently, establishing demographic, political, and racial hierarchies that would define the region well into the modern era.